Hi, everyone. Welcome to this interview with Doing Sociology. As you know, it's been almost over a year that we have been bringing interviews to you. Some of these interviews wouldn't have even been possible had we been still living in pre-COVID, the so-called quote-unquote normal times. And today is one such interview with Professor Leela Fernandes, someone who doesn't need an introduction. This is yet another attempt on our part to create Doing Sociology platform as a bridge where we can make a happen dialogue between scholars from the global north and the global south possible. I welcome my colleague Deepali, who's going to introduce Professor Fernandes to you, and then we'll begin with our discussion.
Thank you, Rituparna. Just to briefly, I'm sure all of you are already familiar with Professor Fernandes's work, but just to briefly introduce you, she is currently the director of the Stanley Golub Chair of International Studies in the University of Washington. And Professor Fernandes has previously taught at the University of Michigan, at Rutgers University, Oberlin College, and she's currently the South Asia editor of the journal Critical Asian Studies. She's recently finished 2 books, Transnational Feminism in the United States, which engages in a critical discussion of interdisciplinary research and theory on transnationalism. She also has edited the Routledge Handbook on Gender and South Asia, which provides a broad overview of feminist scholarship on South Asia, drawing on the works of 23 scholars from South Asia, Europe, and North America. She's currently working on a research project, which is titled The Politics of Water, Inequality, and India's Post-Liberalization State, which looks at the changes in the state and the emergence of new forms of inequality through a study of the water sector in contemporary India. So welcome, ma'am. Thank you so much. It is both an honor, and extreme joy to be talking to you today.
Thank you for that lovely introduction.
So we'll just move on to our questions. The first question that we have for you is, you are one of the pioneering scholars who studied the new Indian middle class. Now, in this context, what we want to know is that, is there any specificity of this new middle class in India?
Yes, so that's a really great question. So, when I started doing the research, it wasn't really meant to be a project which was generalizing about all of the middle classes, because as you both know really well, the middle classes are very complicated. And there's a great deal of differentiation between, say, the lower tiers of the middle classes and so the sort of upper tiers. There's a great deal of differentiation in terms of caste and religion as well. And so when I was working on this idea of the new middle class, it was really more about looking at this social group and this identity which is being crafted in relationship to economic policies of liberalization. So there was a particular political economic context around this social group, which was I was trying to explore, because when I in there, this was a long time ago, it was in the early 1990s when I first started thinking about it. I started to see a correspondence between these visual changes and sort of social and cultural changes around the middle class in the public sphere. And then the policies that were being implemented, by the government around economic reforms. And it was at a time when a lot of political scientists who were writing about the reforms were saying that there was no public debate on the reforms because, for example, there was not a lot of debate in parliament, for example, around the pros and cons. But what my sense was that political scientists at the time were using a very narrow definition of what counts as public political debate. That as you both know, since you're doing public sociology, a lot of times public political debate doesn't take the form of debates in parliament. It happens in through cultural narratives, through public discourses. And that is what I was seeing around this idea of a new middle class. And so it was a very specific formation that I was trying to grapple with at the time.
Right. So, Professor Fernandes, a lot has been also said about how the COVID-19 impact, apart from impacting every sphere of life, is also going to change understandings of class, particularly the middle class in India. A recent report also said that a lot of Indians are going to actually be pushed out of that category because of the hardships of the pandemic. So, how do you see the middle class shaping in the future, and the importance that it would still have for sociologists to study?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good question. I think what COVID has done is it has made visible in a very intense way, the inequalities in India, but also globally, as well as the fragility of many sectors of society. And so, part of what I was trying to disentangle with this idea of the new middle class is that the new middle class was kind of it was a cultural and political construction. And part of what I was trying to argue in some of my earlier work was that in reality, a lot of the political processes around the middle classes were shaped by the gaps and the tensions between this ideal of the new middle class and then the reality of people who are aspiring to it. Because most people don't actually have access to that sort of image that was being that circulates in the public sphere. And so I think what COVID has done is it has really accentuated or sort of made very visible in a very intense sort of short span that fragility of large sections of the middle classes, right? So the middle classes in general, who many of whom are really not that privileged, compared to say like people who are working in like IT, for example. And I think what COVID has shown is that fragility, and also in some ways the myths of the new middle class identity, right? That it's not a situation where everyone has access to this sort of new lifestyle. It's a very aspirational identity, but the reality is very different. And it's not that different, so there are a lot of differences between India and the United States. I know you're thinking also about the global North and South, but it's not, there are ways in which, even if you look at contemporary American society, there was always this idea of an American dream, right? That everybody could aspire to have, a house and a car and a particular kind of lifestyle. And throughout American history, large segments of society have never really had access to that. It's been aspirational. And similarly in the US, large segments of the society were really badly hit by COVID as well. And of course, in India, it's much more serious because India, has, as you know, the poverty is much more widespread. The middle classes are much more fragile, and even if you compare, for example, India and China, the middle classes have not necessarily had the same kind of investment in, for example, healthcare. So there's lots of there are lots of sort of sources of insecurity which have always been part of the middle classes. And so something like COVID just jolts that, and it shows you, how easy it is to fall out of that category. And there's a way in which also, for example, some of the empirical claims about the middle class which focus on income are really, they don't really, in my view, they don't necessarily tell you a lot, because you could have a particular income, which maybe you say is, if you have a cutoff and you can say this is middle class status, but it really depends on your social background. So for example, if you have a certain income and you're just coming out of, let's say, a working class background or say rural background, you might be, for example, supporting an entire generation or family kid network, which is very poor. And so the income doesn't tell you anything about generational wealth, about sort of the stability of your class status is what I would say. And I think COVID just made people confront that in a very intense way.
Right. So the next question is actually related to it. In one of your articles, you talk about the politics of forgetting, and you say that the visibility of the urban middle classes actually sets into motion a politics of forgetting with regard to social groups which are then marginalized by India's policies of liberalization. First of all, what do you think constitutes this politics of forgetting, and do you think that this politics of forgetting has also been very much a part of the policy making during the pandemic in India?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So when I was talking about the politics of forgetting, I was talking about how this, the idea of the new middle class was wrapped up with this idea of a new globalizing India, which was going to break from the past. It was going to break from the Gandhian, Nehruvian past. It was not going to focus on, for example, it was going to focus less on maybe social welfare. It was going to focus on this aspirational idea of an India breaking through globally and economically, kind of entering the world stage as a new economic power. And part of that sort of crafting of that image was also about particularly in urban areas, it was about kind of like sanitizing our understanding of urban areas and bigger cities, and not wanting to sort of look at poverty, wanting to kind of like and some of it is actually about urban redevelopment, right? So for example, redeveloping cities in ways that cater more towards sort of upper middle class sort of lifestyles, right? And so you want to make sure that urban space is quote unquote clean, and I'm putting that in quotes because it's clean is aesthetic, but it's also clean. It has this very disturbing social and economic sort of connotation, because you don't want signs of poverty. If you're in a city which you're projecting as a global city, right? So if you're trying to emulate some of the global cities in wealthier countries, you don't want those kind of reminders that India is actually a very complex country economically, and that large parts of the country are not doing well. That there is widespread poverty. I think in recent years, this has also taken a much more significant direction, where urban-rural divides are really sort of intensifying. And there's, as you know, from the farmers' protests, for example, there's a way in which farmers are trying to make themselves more visible by coming to cities, because that's, it's kind of like that those protest movements are an attempt to say, you can't forget us because we're moving into the urban space, so you can't sort of forget rural India. So that's kind of, in my understanding, would be kind of a battle around that sort of politics of forgetting. What was the second part of your question? I think I forgot the second part.
Right. So I wanted to know if you think the politics of forgetting is also a part of the policy making that we see currently, during the pandemic.
Yeah, yes, because it has to do. So the images of all the migrant workers, and you lived with the sort of experience of seeing migrant workers, for example, and there was no sort of conscious policy of what to do with migrant workers who were trapped, who were in this liminal space, and were having to go back, for example, to their villages. That is kind of the hidden workforce, which makes everything work in the cities, and it's part of that rural-urban divide as well. So it's about labor, it's about migration. And the fact that that people were basically left to fend for themselves is kind of a failure of policy. It's a failure of state policy in many ways. But even some of the general sort of global discussions of social distancing, for example, obviously that was something which is needed in a medical sense. So this is not a critique of the fact that we needed social distancing, but I didn't. And I'll admit, this is not something I'm researching, but as an observer, I didn't see any deep thought from policymakers as what does this mean for poorer countries where you can't socially distance? What does this mean for poor communities where there isn't that luxury of space? Physical space is often linked to social space, right? So if you are from a poor community, you're living in sort of very crowded context. So what does social distancing even mean? And I don't know that I heard much thoughtfulness in terms of policy, and how do these policies get implemented if you're not wealthy? If you are living with a family in a one-room place, if you're lucky, because poor people don't even have that. So even if you have a pakka house, for example, with walls, the levels of poverty are sometimes so deep that we forget that, right? That in some people don't even have that luxury. But even if you had that, the concrete walls, oftentimes it's very common, as for people to be living in a major, either in a large family within that, or sometimes, workers often, for example, live in shifts because they don't have housing for factories. So where was the policy that even thought about those kinds of those kinds of social, physical processes, and sort of linked to that, where was the policy to really to count deaths, to think about mortality in ways that didn't undercount people who were dying, so that lives of poor people mattered, and we would want to know, like, did people die of COVID? A lot of the undercounting is also about policy and socioeconomic class as well.
Thank you for that response, Professor Fernandes. Now, our next question to you is based on something that you wrote in 2006, where you were talking about the middle class and its role in politics. So I would like to quote you here. You wrote that the dominant fraction of the middle class plays a central role in the politics of hegemony. Since 2006, a lot has happened in the country and is continuing to happen. We would like to know from you, how do you see the role of the middle class evolve in the democratic politics today in India?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Let me back up a little bit and say that part of what I was trying to do with the theory of hegemony, and sometimes that gets lost in the way in which my work is sometimes cited, because there's a tendency to want to think of the middle class in terms of consumption practices. And part of what I was trying to foreground is the idea that we think of the middle class as a project of which is linked to state power and state formation. So to think more seriously about middle class state linkages, and that's also what I was kind of referring to when I was talking about policy and public sphere. Like, the middle class the narratives around the middle class were allowing a certain kind of state policy to get enacted in very complex, subtle ways. So there's an ideological part to that as well, which is always part of any hegemonic project. And so one of the things we have seen in recent years is that the swings in the middle class voting patterns are having an impact in terms of electoral politics. It used to be in the Indian context that, political scientists would talk about this puzzle where middle class voting levels were lower than, say, more sort of popular and sort of cross class voting patterns. And there was a tendency to not think of the middle classes as an electorally significant constituency. And that has changed in recent decades. And so shifts in the middle class can make a big difference in terms of which parties are in power. So, for example, middle class support, as most people know, for particularly urban upper. So again, to distinguish, so urban upper class urban upper class upper caste middle class support for the BJP was very significant in bringing the BJP to power. Going back even to the early days of BJP support. So it gives you a sense of how that swing vote can make a big difference. And if you look at, for example, the 2014 election, you will see that Modi had a very sophisticated understanding of the role of the middle class, and what he was doing when he talked about, I believe he talked about the neo middle class, is he was actually trying to come up with an ideological political construction which was weaving together this sort of new liberalizing middle class with some of the broader sections, who need state support. So if you look at the BJP manifesto from that time, they were talking about needing to give more state support. So it's not always about pulling away state support, but it was a very clear, careful political strategy. And so that to me shows the recognition from political leaders of the role of the middle class. And so what that does mean, so I don't really know what this means in predictive terms, but it does mean that there can be real social and political consequences, because if the middle class swing can make such a big difference, it changes the electoral calculus. So, before we used to think of the fact that political parties needed to make sure they had strong rural constituencies, right? Because of the nature of electoral politics. But if the middle classes become such a key swing constituency, that also allows politicians to engage in this politics of forgetting, which we were talking about earlier, because it allows them to look at other kinds of constituencies. And the last thing I'll add is that it's not just, when we talk about the middle class as a swing vote, it's not just necessarily about people who are who already have middle class status, because it can also be segments of society who are aspiring to middle class status, right? So for example, some of the recent survey data on rural areas in India, which political scientists have done, have shown that large segments of, younger generation farmers, they don't want to go into farming. They want to basically go into more urban oriented occupations. Now, they may not have middle class privilege in the way in which it's talked about, but if they're aspiring to that middle class privilege, they might connect with the identity, and that could have political consequences. And so what that means is that when we're thinking about political implications, that the calculations are much more complicated than they used to be, that it's not just these sort of predefined voting blocks that people assumed. It's a lot about it. A lot of it is about aspiration. It's about cultural identity. It's about political crafting that politicians do when they're trying to appeal to people. And that can have a real difference in terms of who gets elected or not elected at the national level.
Right. So, Professor Fernandes, this is something that is spoken about a lot, about the intersection of the middle class category with, of course, caste and gender. But we would like to hear from you, how this intersection plays out, particularly in the present context in Indian society.
Yeah, and so that's a really, in some ways, that's such a big question. I could only maybe do a small bite of the question because there's so much, as you know, because caste and gender are so complicated, and caste and gender also intersect. A lot of times when we are talking about gender, we have to be very careful that we're not reinscribing caste-based understandings of gender. There's oftentimes, caste often has this invisible presence, even in feminist discourse. And a lot of Dalit feminists have talked about that. A lot of times feminist discourses are often talking about particular upper caste versions of gender inequality. So that in itself becomes something which needs to be unpacked. In terms of caste, it's complicated because, there are, for example, people from say Dalit backgrounds who are new entrants to middle class status. Even in, for example, not just even just in cities, but even in small towns, for example, education is a strategy of getting access to middle class status. And it's also can be a strategy that subaltern groups use to undo some of the stigma that has been placed on them. So those are strategies that different caste groups can use as strategies of upward mobility. At the same time, I think research has shown that there are real caste barriers to access this dream of this new middle class, right? Because if you look at, for example, the IT industry, there's a lot of sociologists have done research which have shown that the IT industry has real invisible barrier, has both visible and invisible barriers for entry from people who are not from upper caste backgrounds, right? So there's a way in which some of the new employment, some of the what is it called, the new economy jobs, which we think of as IT or pharmaceuticals, et cetera, some of the more elite jobs, they are also sites where caste is reproduced, right? By, for example, not either consciously or not consciously allowing entry towards access to different caste groups. So there's a lot of, so I don't have, I can't give you sort of definitive answers because this is an area which needs much, much more research. And you see it sometimes politically expressed. So for example, there have been at different points movements for reservations in the private sector. And that of course causes a political backlash. But the deeper question is for us to understand why those movements come up. Those movements come up because people see that the private sector is where a lot of the wealthier jobs are now located. And they know that they're not getting access, right? So reservations just becomes a political means for calling to question those structural barriers for entry for different caste groups. But it's a very complicated subject. It also varies by region, by local state, and then religion complicates this as well because Muslim populations, middle class Muslims are not faring as well, in socially and economically for reasons I know that you already know.
Yeah, I think think you've mentioned it very well in the sense of the intersections and that they need much more research and elaboration, and that cannot be answered in a question like this. Thank you for your answer, though. Last question, Professor Fernandes, is that, we cannot not talk about the global when we are looking at the changes in terms of class and middle class in India. So how would you map the impact of global forces on the construction of this new middle class in India?
That's also, so you're asking really, really good questions, really big questions. So again, I'll give you a small piece of the answer because it's so big, so I guess the short answer is it's so complicated, because in so many ways, this new middle class identity, which emerged in the 1990s, that specific liberalizing identity was part of a global process, because it had to do with economic policies designed to integrate India's economy into the global economy in a new kind of way, and in an accelerated way. So there's already a global dimension to that. However, the new middle class identity also has very strong nationalist underpinnings, which also then, as when we talked about, for example, electoral politics, that also relates in some ways to religious nationalism in complicated ways. It's not a one-to-one correspondence. Sometimes people just assume the new middle class is religious nationalist. I don't think it's that simple, but there are definitely complexities, because large segments of the upper middle classes have supported in many ways some of the religious nationalist political parties. So the global is both linked, but also in a complicated relationship with sort of nationalist politics. And then, of course, diasporic politics is part of the transnational process, right? So the Indian diaspora plays a role in what is happening, both politically, but also in terms of sort of economic processes, both in terms of its support. For example, the Indian diaspora in the US has had very strong support for the BJP, sort of generally. As an example, and economically, the sort of quote unquote opening up of India's economy or the accelerated opening up, I would say, in the 1990s, intensified those linkages and the sort of avenues for diasporic Indians to play a role economically, socially, politically. And so that's also part of the global process as well. And then the other part of it is, so much of this new identity is about India wanting to have or claiming its own assertive role globally, right? So it's not just about the rest of the world affecting India, but it's about India's own sense of national identity, in a dominant sense of national identity, of seeing itself as a global player economically and politically. And you see that, for example, in terms of its changing relationship with the United States, that kind of closer relationship that has developed, and some of the nationalist sentiment of India being an autonomous, independent player, which feeds into kind of the sort of patriotic nationalist side of the middle classes. So it's very complicated. So that's the best I can do in a few minutes.
Right. Absolutely. Thank you, Professor Fernandes. This interview has been just incredible, because you have very well sort of, explained so many important issues, which we as, I can speak for myself, but I'm sure Rituparna would also agree that as early stage researchers trying to make sense of Indian society in the contemporary times, I think, these are very important questions. And this is, talking to you has just made everything so much more clear. So, and I'm sure, our viewers, when they're going to go and hear you speak, they'll take so much from this interview. So thank you again for taking time out to do this with us today. It's been just incredible talking to you.
No, you're welcome, and it's I really commend you for what you're doing with this project. I think it's really wonderful, and I think it's a model for public academic knowledge. So congratulations, and thank you for including me.
Thank you so much. Maybe, Deepali, you want to stop the recording?